Yeah, I'd like to build on what Helen has said and tell you why I think the DRD matters to industry and how it changes the perspective of risk around decommissioning for oil and gas companies, and indeed, as Mike said, why some of us spent and thought it important to spend a considerable time on this process over the last couple of years. And as Mike would testify, there were some really quite mind-numbing sessions in negotiating all of this and keeping industry together and so on through the process. And I'll illustrate it with a little bit of context from my own company, Taka, and tell you just why it's significant for us in a moment. So, yeah, as Helen has said, what we're trying to do is to find some certainty about an unusual situation where we're making decisions which will have long-term implications because decommissioning many years hence, and the tax relief is only available at the time of decommissioning of a 35 billion pound cost across the industry. These are photos of the abandonment decommissioning of BP's Northwest Hutton platform in the last 2 or 3 years. It dates me, but I think Northwest Hutton started production the year I started work. And at Enterprise Oil, where I was a number of years, we owned a stake in it for a while. And in fact, at Taka at the moment, we own the reservoir rights, the exploration rights to the same license underneath this. Now it has been decommissioned. So these are things that have gone for quite a long time, and that's why the uncertainty has been there about whether the tax would ultimately be, tax relief would ultimately be available. And indeed that risk was, I think, which has been held in the industry for some time, heightened in the 2011 budget, where, as you know, tax rates were raised, but the rate of tax relief on decommissioning was restricted. So it opened up a gap between the rates of tax on profits and the relief on decommissioning. And so people said, well, will we actually get this relief for decommissioning when we incur the costs in the future? So a 2-year project, as Helen said, very cooperative, or tempted to say almost an unprecedented sort of cooperative effort between industry staying together, focused on the objective with Treasury, HMRC, with DEC, numerous advisors who were key to helping us get there. And through the DRD process and then the subsequent security agreement process, with the aim of freeing up capital and removing a key investment risk for acquirers of late life fields such as Taka, my own company. And the North Sea, and there's plenty of data on this, is unusual in terms of the concentration of assets for a mature oil and gas province in the hands of a relatively small number of companies. So, and some of the new entrants are certainly bringing new investment to the North Sea. So let me give you an example of how this risk matters. In terms of 2 risks, the value uncertainty risk and the financial security risk. The value piece, I can illustrate this with one of the bigger acquisitions that Taka has made in the North Sea back in 2008, when we acquired interests in the Cormorant area fields and Tern and Ida and the Brent system up in the East Shetland Basin from Shell and Exxon. The stated purchase price was 445 million after adjustments and so on. That's the number in the accounts. The decommissioning cost provided at the time on those assets was just under $1 billion, and it's probably increased since. The tax relief assumed on that decommissioning was variously, because of the fields, some pay PRT, some don't, between 50 and 75% of that 956. So you can see that in judging your purchase price of the asset and is it going to be a good deal, yes, of course, you'll have sensitivities on oil price and OPEX and everything else. But the value of the tax on the decommissioning bill, and the decommissioning bill is effectively part of the consideration you're paying to, when you assume that, when you acquire the assets, is very significant to the overall decision. So getting people to buy later life assets is crucial, that they have some, or they can form some view, some certainty on actually getting that tax relief and what decommissioning will cost them. If you turn to financial security in the bottom table here, and assume a decommissioning cost of £100, the actual post-tax cost of that, depending again on which field you're in, is it paying PRT or not, post-tax it will either cost you £50 if you're getting relief for corporation tax and supplementary charge, or £25 if you're also getting full relief for PRT. The typical security agreement in the industry says that if you've got a decommissioning bill of 100, you have to allow for some uncertainty and you apply a risk factor, so you have to provide security of 150. You are therefore providing security of up to 6 times the actual ultimate post-tax cost. You're effectively providing security for the government share, and that is tying up capital, whether explicitly tying up capital in the forms of cash or letters of credit in trust, or less clearly, it's still tying up capital even if you don't have to provide that security in the views of, for example, rating agencies and others looking at your debt and leverage levels. Having that certainty is still effectively freeing capital in the balance sheet of even the bigger companies. So just a little bit of context, Taka very briefly. Taka is from Abu Dhabi. We're largely owned by the Abu Dhabi government. Although listed, there is a free float on the Abu Dhabi exchange. We're a power company around the world. We produce 95% or so of the water and the power in Abu Dhabi. So if you've been there, that's what's been powering your hotel room and so on. We're one of the largest independent power producers around the world, with plants in places like Morocco and Ghana and the US and India. We're also an oil and gas business, the largest business being in North America onshore, the second largest being here in the North Sea, but also in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, the Netherlands, and 1 or 2 other areas. In the North Sea, through a series of acquisitions over the last 7 years, Taka has built a position. The core operating capability at the moment is in the East Shetland Basin. We operate 4 of the big old platforms there, including Cormorant Alpha, which is the hub of the Brent pipeline system, which we also operate. We're a clear example, along with some of the others from Korea, China, etc., of the new entrants into the North Sea, and we'd like to think we have brought new investment. We've invested about $2 billion in development capital, leaving aside the acquisition costs since taking on these assets, upgrading them and new development drilling, new satellites and so on. Actually, doubled production from these old fields, and obviously helped by the oil price, it's gone pretty well up there. We also face a $3 billion decommissioning bill across these assets and the ones in the central North Sea, which include the Bray fields here. A little bit more about that in a moment. So turning to the DRD, Helen's given you the background to this. Over 2.5 years, the whole process. It started out a meeting in a hotel room in Aberdeen, and I think 23 ideas were tabled as mechanisms that might help with the fiscal certainty for decommissioning. The one that was landed on was a contractual basis, and specifically this sort of effectively a contract for difference, as Helen described. The contractual basis was selected because it was felt it would be very difficult, and there's very little precedent, if any, for government avoiding a contractual obligation in this way, and we got strong counsel's opinion to support the robustness of the mechanism. The legislation was in Finance Act 2013, and it has already been described. Payments will be due from the government if the tax relief at the time of ultimate decommissioning, when you incur the expenditure, is less than if you'd incurred that expenditure under the rules of Finance Act 13. So it's a contract for difference, but only a one-way contract in that sense, though clearly industry has obligations as well under the contract. It works like this, in summary. Each company has a DRD executed with Treasury. You can't assign that. It doesn't go with the asset, it goes with the company. We looked at whether an asset should have contracts, and said no, companies should have them, and you rely on your own contract. You're not actually concerned whether your co-venturers have a contract themselves, although indirectly you probably are, because it's unlikely a joint venture will move to a post-tax security basis unless everybody's already got their DRD. But you claim under your own, and that's important to remember, not under someone else's, if there ever is a claim in a default situation. So you look at the decommissioning expenditure incurred, you decide, you calculate how much relief you would have got for that under Finance Act 13. You compare it, that's the reference amount, you compare it with what you are actually getting under the rules at the time, and if there's a difference, then that's paid out under the DRD. And it's hard to see why companies operating in the North Sea would not want to have one of these. In the form of a diagram, so you're comparing on the left the tax position at the date of decommissioning the legislation at that time with the reference amount under the DRD. You have to decide, Helen's already described this imposition scenario, the word used here, are you effectively dealing with a default or a forfeiture case? If you're not, if you're in the ordinary course of business, it's not imposition. You calculate the reference amount there, and ultimately you will get a shortfall payment if the maximum is not being given to you under the tax regime at the time. And success in this means that there is never a DRD payment actually made, as Helen said. That would hopefully be the expectation, because there's no reason to change the tax rules if this is going to lead to a payment. Of course, it could lead to a payment in a default situation. If we look at CT specifically, and then turn to PRT, on the right-hand side there, the reference amount in a default scenario, there's effectively a floor. You'll always get 50% relief. Government took the view, I think, that default is A, going to be extremely rare, B, we've assumed we'll give this tax relief to the person incurring the expenditure anyway, so let's just put a floor there. It simplified a lot of the process. In the ordinary course of business event, there is no set floor on the tax relief, but you can only get less than the current 50% if the tax rate on profits goes down from where it is today. Both can go up, both can go down effectively, but there is no ultimate floor. So Parliament can still change tax rates, but it wouldn't harm you in this situation if you're getting less relief, if you've also got less tax on profits. Then, as you would expect, there's a deal of complexity around things like anti-avoidance and payment schedules and all sorts of scenarios people considered were risks, hopefully academic risks. But there's a lot of detail there. PRT was complex. The prize for including PRT here is significant because it takes you from the assurance of 50% relief to potentially to 75%. But the problem with PRT is that all fields are different. Some have paid lots, some fields liable to PRT have never paid any, some may have an effective rate due to allowances between those two extremes. So PRT has to be based on the tax history of the actual field. And you get protection under the DRD effectively against abolition of PRT, reduction of the rate of decommissioning relief for PRT. You still need to have capacity, you need to have paid PRT, or your predecessors do, in the history of that field in order to get PRT relief. And I guess that's only fair. What this means is that in a joint venture security situation, you need to know what the PRT history of your co-venturers are, and that may go back through a chain of ownership extending through several sale and purchase agreements. So the mechanism was introduced of being able to get from HMRC a PRT certificate which sets out that history. So it will tell you at any point in time, and will be updated, how much PRT relief can be expected for that field. And actually for most fields it will be pretty obvious. It will be up there at the 50% or nothing, but there's a few, and some of them are important fields, that do lie in the middle. So if we look at the risk profile that companies have now that we have DRDs, let's not lose sight of the big picture here, which is still about how much it costs to decommission. Big estimating risk here about and different techniques. Do you take platforms away, so-called piece small, by sort of reverse of the installation process in pieces with cranes? There is new kit appearing, such as the picture here. It's a vessel being built called the Peter Shelter. Huge vessel, size of a couple of aircraft carriers, like a catamaran, sails up, platform in the middle of the two bows there, and then cranes will lift off the entire top sides, is the plan. And it can also lift the jackets. So there is new equipment appearing. This is an area of developing technology, but there's lots of uncertainty. Which rigs will be available at the time of decommissioning for subsea wells? How much will they cost? We have a pretty good idea, I think, of what will actually be required in terms of decommissioning, what has to be removed and so on, and can jacket footings and drill cuttings left in place, because it actually disturbs the environment even more if you try and move those. But there's still uncertainty around the cost, the timing of decommissioning. That depends on oil price and so on. And you still are exposed to the post-tax default risk on your co-venturers. But on the tax front, a lot of the risks that, if you like, with no DRD are coloured red here, move to green if you do have a DRD in place. You still, for corporation tax, have to have paid some corporation tax. You have to have some history or capacity to get relief against. But you are protected against a restriction in the rate of, a further restriction in the rate of tax relief, against changes in what qualifies as decommissioning expenditure and so on. You are protected against the abolition of PRT, a reduction in the rates of PRT at the last minute when you're about to decommission. And in the imposition, the default scenario, it's a very simple flaw in terms of the corporation tax relief and a mechanism to help you understand what relief would be available if you want to go against your partner's tax capacity. You can go against your own tax capacity as well, but one or the other makes the move to post-tax security, which is one of the key aims of the whole project, makes it plausible, gets the major companies who are typically the beneficiaries of security comfortable that they could move to post-tax security. So having got the DRD, we then went into a process of revising the template security agreement in industry. That now exists in a post-tax form. Again, fairly complex, but it allows security to be provided for the lesser amount, anticipating tax relief where it's going to be available. Defines a whole series of so-called adverse tax events where you might have to flip back to pre-tax in unlikely situations. We think it's a pretty robust mechanism, but if a court, for example, found the DRD was, notwithstanding our council's opinion that it was unenforceable, there is a mechanism that protects the beneficiaries where you flip back. And also a load of detail on how payments are made out of the trust and that sort of thing. So the DRD, I think, is an enabler for new investment. I think there are plenty of examples around. There's plenty of evidence, as the chart on the left here, which is a deck chart, shows where new operators have come in after an acquisition, raised investment, raised production. Taka is an example. As I said, in the northern North Sea, we've doubled production in the fields up there, invested quite a lot of money, expect to recover 100 million barrels more than was the expectation at the time that the fields were actually bought. And you can actually run a calculation of having done that and changing the profile, what it actually does to the government's tax take over time. And we estimated that was about a £2 billion improvement to government cash flow over the life of the fields from that incremental investment of having new players come into the older assets. Having the DRD certainly facilitated the last deal we did, which closed last year. We bought a package of assets in the central North Sea, including the Harding field here from BP for just over $1 billion, and further interests in the Bray area as well, which have significant decommissioning obligations. I'm not saying that we only did it because of that, because the DRD was there, but it certainly eased all the discussions, facilitated the deal being done, that this mechanism was about to be introduced. And certainly took away one of the bigger risks that we would otherwise have to have considered in looking at that deal. Helen mentioned there has been a study done by Hannon Westwood of what the broader impact of this could be across the industry, across the North Sea, and they came up with as much as a 2 billion barrel prize from the change from having fiscal certainty on decommissioning. And I think that's plausible when you look at companies like Taka, as I say, £2 billion, $3 billion extra government take from one new entrant. If you add several new entrants and new investors, you get to a significant total prize. So we're now in the implementation phase in terms of companies getting their DRDs, renegotiating security agreements. I think that will take a time. There will be temptation on the part of companies to introduce other factors. I think we've had a clear steer that the effect of this should not be negated by companies trying to increase other risk factors and so on that go into the security calculation. But I think it helps to put in place a regime for late life fields and investments. If you put it alongside the brownfield tax allowances, and if we've got a stable fiscal platform there, then investing in these older fields can produce attractive cash flow, even if they have so high tax rates. I think there are one or two bits of unfinished business to be picked up at time, because the way brownfield allowances and field allowances work late in field life, if you're carrying back decommissioning cost, perhaps doesn't work as we'd hope. And there is a key issue here about the infrastructure assets remaining in place for new fields to use in the later life of the North Sea, which is a key part of the Wood Report process that's ongoing at the moment. There will be a version 2 of the security agreement which tackles things other than tax. So the issue, for example, that the industry standard agreement requires a AA credit rating, and there aren't, as you know, that many banks these days that have AA credit ratings to give you LCs anyway. So there are a number of issues that we will have to tackle. But overall, I would conclude that the DRDs are an elegant measure, the contract for difference, to, at no cost for government, give us the certainty we needed, enable us to make new investment. They will encourage new acquisitions in the North Sea and entrants to come in and buy assets, and they will free up capital directly by reducing security requirements and indirectly just by the impact on people's balance sheets and the way they look at their debts. It's likely to be critical as we move forward in the North Sea. Decommissioning is getting closer, whichever way we like it, though we keep trying to put it, invest to move it out into the future. And I think you'll also see a developing industry around decommissioning, such as these new pieces of equipment, new vessels and so on, to actually work decommissioning more efficiently. So, thank you.